Are you looking for a redo in your year 2022? Well, you've come to the right place today. We're going to look at a principle that you can either leverage to benefit your life this year or that you can ignore. But ultimately, our whole conversation is about taking responsibility for your life this year. Welcome to today's episode of Beyond at Home. But before we talk about this all-powerful and life-transforming principle, I want to show you an experiment. It has to do with this bark. There's ants all over this thing. But before I talk to you about this all-powerful and life-transforming principle that we can be aware of in our own life, I want to ask you a question. Did you ever have an inflatable pool when you were little? I had an inflatable pool when I was little. It was my favorite thing. Come home from school, do some circular laps. We had this awesome round pool. But the one thing I could never do in my pool was float. And I didn't realize why I couldn't float until I probably got into middle school. And that's when I first learnt about this really unique principle. It was a principle that was discovered by a guy named Archimedes. He had the principle named after him, Archimedes Principles. And really what Archimedes discovered was something that had been around in our world forever, but he kind of discovered it for the first time. It was the relationship between buoyancy and gravity, or really the first condition of equilibrium. And what Archimedes is really looking at is how things float, kind of like this piece of bark.
It sunk.
Why did it sink?
It sunk.
How did that sink? I thought bark floated. And listen, this is really what Archimedes' principle is kind of explaining. Down to paper, Archimedes discovered that a weight could be supported in a liquid if the weight of the object was counterbalanced by the displacement of the water of the object. And you might be thinking Riley, this is math. Isn't this meant to be a beyond church thing or something like that? Is there really math? And to answer that, yes, this is math. And yes, there will be homework at the end of this conversation. But the reason I wanted to talk to you about this principle is that this principle is neither kind of good or bad, right? It just is. It's neither good or bad. And when we look at this principle in action, for a swimmer who's struggling to swim, that's because of buoyancy and their relationship to gravity. And at the same time, for the lifeguard who throws out kind of that lifesaver tube. Okay, so really what I'm getting to paraphrase, is that Archimedes' Principles explains why a swimmer struggles to float or swim and why a floaty floats in itself. But really, the big thing I want to get to here is introduce us to this principle that has just existed across time. It just is what it is. It's this principle that we reap what we sow. We reap what we sow. And what's crazy is that this is a principle that was actually gifted to us by God. Again, it's neither good news or bad news. It just is what it is. Oh, that's right. I'm going to tell you about a guy named Paul now. You see, this principle is actually introduced to us through a letter that a guy named Paul wrote around the 60s to a church, or an early church in Galatia. And really what Paul is addressing is how we can leverage this principle in our own life to benefit us, because the cost of ignoring it means we won't just pay the price for ourselves, but those around us will pay the price as well. Remember what we were talking about in our last episode of Beyond at Home? Irresponsibility eventually becomes somebody else's responsibility. So here's a little bit of what we can learn about this principle gifted to us by God, and also what we can learn about Paul's letter to the early church in Galatia. Letter time. Here's what Paul has to say. He writes to these early followers of Jesus and he says, "If any of you think you are something when you are nothing, you deceive yourselves. Each of you should test your own actions." And really what Paul is getting to here is he's saying, if any of you think you are something by comparing yourself to others, when you ignore your issues by focusing on other people's stuff, at the end of the day, you're deceiving yourself, you're fooling yourself. And Paul adds on that each of us should test our own actions and make a critical examination of our behavior first before we go about judging others. So his big thing here is don't spend so much time evaluating others. Look in the mirror and work on you first. And then Paul goes on to write, then you can take pride in yourself without comparing yourself to somebody else, for each of you should carry your own load. Again, Paul is kind of saying if I focus on you, if I focus on other people, I'll make excuses. But if I focus on me, well, I'll make progress. Paul's big shout here is to take responsibility for yourself. This is what he's telling these early followers of Jesus. He's saying, don't compare, don't make excuses. And then Paul makes a little bit of a side comment to those of us who are really good at talking ourselves out of things with excuses. Paul writes, do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. In other words, just don't try that. Don't try that on God. Don't try that on the creator of the universe. He's not going to pamper you. You can't outwit him here. Paul is saying to us, and he's saying to me, like, I gotta take responsibility for my irresponsibility. And then Paul wraps up in this letter, wraps up with this big challenge. This is what he gives the early church in Galatia. And the challenge and the principle, this is the principle that we are really left to wrestle with. Paul writes, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. Again, it's this big principle of what you sow, you reap. What you sow, you reap. And you see, what Paul doesn't say here is that people reap what they sow unless they ask God, unless they serve at their church, unless they pray, unless they start going to church in the first place, unless they apologize. Paul says what we really all know intuitively is that life is connected. And that the decisions you make today ultimately determine the story that you tell tomorrow. It's neither good news or bad news, it just is what it is, but it's up to us to leverage that how we want to. We can choose to ignore it, or we can choose to use this principle for our benefit. And if you're at a time in your life right now where you just feel stuck, where you know that there's things that you need to start taking responsibility for, you know there's some relationships in your life that are just feeling messy, and you're ready to put some next steps in place to better that relationship for yourself and those around you, then I want to give you, hopefully, what I think is a great next step for you today, and it all points back to how you can leverage this principle. Is that a good exit? Next steps. Step 1, identify the things that you are responsible for. When you begin to kind of name those things instead of just blaming other people for your own irresponsibility, you may begin to realize that the things you are responsible for are actually really simple. That you're actually responsible for how you respond to other people. Whilst you can't control how other people respond, you can control your own response. Maybe that looks like responding in kindness, with more self-control, with more patience. What does it look like for you to identify the things that you are responsible for? But then from there, once you identify those things and actually recognize what your part of the pie is in that conflict circle, then you can begin to start doing what you really should be doing more of. You can begin to stop gossiping in your friendship circles because you want better relationships. You can start investing and encouraging your friends instead. If it's financial troubles, you can stop just spending sparingly and actually start doing things like making a plan or having someone to keep you accountable to your finances. If it's family life that you're really wrestling with right now, that's a real tricky spot for you, you can start investing your time in spending quality time with your family and stop living that crazy, frantic, busy life. What is it that you need to start doing? What can you do now that you've identified the things that you're responsible for? At the end of the day, owning the things that you're responsible for allows you to stop making excuses and start making progress. And what you may find in this time of identifying the things you're responsible for, and in this time of actioning the things that you really ought to be doing and know that you should be doing, you may begin to see just how God is at work in your life. You may begin to see that the things that He's actually trying to bring to the surface so that you can step into the person that you were created to be. But first, we have to start paying attention to our own irresponsibility and the ways that we can be more responsible. We have to stop, we have to pause, we have to identify, we have to start to do. And beginning to do all these things extends an invitation to us. Bro, there's another plane. Where are we? Is that Caboolture Airfield? But first, we have to pay attention to our own irresponsibility. We have to start to identify where our responsibility lies. We have to start doing what we should have been doing the whole time. And see, when we begin to pay attention to these things, we begin to actually invite God into showing us the evidence of how He's working in big ways and how He's working in the really small and subtle ways too. We begin the process of actually learning more about ourselves, more about others, and more about Him. And at the end of the day, the decisions that we tell today determine the story we tell tomorrow. We reap what we sow later and greater. And when we begin to give ourselves the time to reflect on this, we begin to move forward in a very exciting journey of our own personal growth. And for those of us who are seeking it out, very exciting journey of our own personal faith story. Hey, if you're keen for joining us for our next episode of Beyond at Home and carrying on with this story of taking responsibility for your own life, you gotta click subscribe. It'll keep you up to date with all the latest. And at the same time, if you enjoyed today, if you've got some questions you want to explore a little bit more about this particular episode, jump in the comment section below. We'd love to hear from you, engage with you as well. Have a great rest of your week.